What's up, guys? This is Kephas.
Today I'm going to show you the macro that I've created for Arms Warriors using GSE in The War Within. Now, as straightforward as Arms Warriors are to play, they're actually one of the harder classes that I found to macro, especially for melee classes. And for me personally, they're actually kind of hard for me to play just because there are so many different things to try to keep track of. There are different damage windows and just different situations and a lot of different rage spinners. And so all that together kind of makes for a challenging playstyle that, like I said, has been a little bit of a challenge to macro, but I do feel like I've come up with something that seems to work fairly well, and it will consolidate a lot of things, and you will have some options on how you want to move forward with maybe simplifying it further or just going with something that maybe feels a little bit more comfortable for you. But we'll get into that as we go through this here, okay? The biggest thing is that this is almost an all-in-one macro with the help of modifiers. And so the one thing that you're going to have to use separately will be sweeping strikes for AoE. And that's why this is technically a 2-button playstyle over a 1-button playstyle, just because of sweeping strikes. But aside from that, the macro is going to do pretty much everything. And I've tried really hard to come up with a macro that will work for both playstyles, both Slayer and Colossus. And if you want to check out the talent builds that I'm using for each hero path, then you can head to the talents tab of this macro and you will find import strings for both there. They are labeled and you can check them out. You can also just check out Wowhead's Mythic Plus builds. Those are often the ones I tend to go with. So either way, that's what you can do. But with all that being said, talked about a lot here, let's go ahead and take a look at what this macro actually does. So the biggest challenge is spending rage. There are different abilities for spending rage for different reasons, and trying to get them all inside of this macro and control how much rage that we're spending so that we're not, rage starved all the time is the biggest challenge, okay? And so this first block is going to do a lot, and this is where all of your modifiers are. So if you hold down shift, the macro will use cleave, of course, if it's not on cooldown already. And then of course you can hold down control for execute if you're in execute rage or you're using sudden death. And then of course we have thunderclap. If you hold down alt, this is how you can apply rend to your target or to multiple targets. Again, thunderclap will have a cooldown. And then of course, without holding down any modifier, the macro will use slam. This is kind of your default filler that is going to be spending some rage. So the biggest challenge here is, especially with slam, trying not to spend too much rage. And it is a challenge. What I've done is I've made this into a repeat block, and I've added the number 4, which means that every 4th button press on this macro, it's going to try to reuse this block. So what I found is that it will use slam a lot, but mostly when the other abilities in this macro are on cooldown. So your mileage may vary. There may be times where you may feel like it's using slam too much. You can do a couple of things. You can try to adjust this number inside the repeat block to see what feels better for you. You can also just remove this block entirely and then just use all these abilities on separate buttons. That wouldn't be too hard to do because you would just be able to, track your rage and use the appropriate ability. You're only going to use thunderclap when it's available to reapply rend most of the time. Cleave has a cooldown as well, so that's another one that you can kind of mess around with. So you have options there. But what I've tried to do is consolidate this as much as I can and try to make slam part of the things that the macro will handle, so you don't have to worry about it. But that's an option, and so that's what I would recommend if you're not feeling how this is handling your rage. That's going to fix most of the issues, but it is going to give you a few more buttons to press. So this is going to be the biggest thing. So the next thing, of course, this is where we get into our big cooldowns. We have Thunderous Roar, followed by Warbreaker, and I've added Avatar in there because it's ideal to try and use these ones together. And of course, if you're using Colossus Smash instead, then Warbreaker will switch to Colossus Smash. It's the alternative. Next up is we have Blade Storm. This is another kind of optional thing. So you can either pick Bladestorm or Ravager. And so if you switch to Ravager, again, this macro will use Ravager instead. And that's why I've added in that player command in the side of this block, even though it's with Bladestorm, doesn't make sense for that. But if you switch over the Ravager, then it will put Ravager at your feet. And that's how the macro would be able to use Ravager, because otherwise macros can't really use ground targeting abilities very well. And so generally for melee classes, I can use in that player and it does pretty good. So that's how that's going to work. And so those are your big cooldowns. Then we move into a sequence loop. And so this is where like our shorter cooldown abilities are going to be, abilities that we want to use more often. A lot of these abilities out here have much longer cooldowns. And so the idea here is that we're going to try to spend a little bit of time inside of this loop and focus on trying to use these abilities. And then after 4 cycles, we'll break out of this loop, and then we'll actually go back to the top and do the same thing over and over again. Remember, we do have a repeat block that's inserting itself in there occasionally as well. So that's how that's going to work. Okay, so first up, we have Mortal Strike. The macro is going to use that one on cooldown. Then we have Demolish. And so the macro is going to use that one. And then last up, we have Overpower, and of course that's the last thing the macro is going to do. So the macro is going to cycle through these 4 times. It's going to break out, it's going to go back to the top, and then it's going to do it all over again. And actually, I had made a change that I don't know if I forgot to save or what happened, but I will fix this real quick.
A few moments later.
Okay, so this is what I've done, and this is what I think is better. So what this is going to do is, if you're playing a Colossus and you know Demolish, then the macro is going to use Demolish. If you're playing a Slayer, most of the time Slayers like to use Skull Splitter. So if you choose this as a talent, then the macro will use Skull Splitter if you know it. The big thing here is don't play a Colossus and use Skull Splitter, because then the macro probably isn't going to use Demolish. If you're doing that, then what you'd want to do is you would want to create a new block here, and you would want to put like separate these, have one for Demolish and one for Skull Splitter. That's how you can fix that. But in general, what I found is that Skull Splitter is generally only used for Slayer builds. So this is how it works for me. And so this way, whether you're, using one or the other, if you're using neither, then the macro will just skip past this block and it won't be a big deal. But that's how that works. And for the builds that I'm using, this works out pretty well. So for either build, you'll either have Demolish or Skull Splitter, and the macro will use the one accordingly. And so both of these have relatively short cooldowns. Of course, Demolish's cooldown will be reduced as you play the class, so you're going to be using it more often than what the cooldown might suggest. And so this way you have both of these in here, and that's how this is going to work. Okay, so again, you cycle through these 4 times, keeping these abilities on cooldown, breaking out and going back to your longer cooldown abilities, using your fillers as you need to with your rage, and of course handling your modifiers to keep track of those. And that's pretty much how the macro is going to work. You have to remember that with macros like these, it's always going to be touch and go. Your mileage may vary. This is one of those classes where, there's a lot of synergy. There's a lot of like using certain abilities together within certain windows. You've got the Colossus Smash window. You're keeping up with, Rend and different effects like that. So it's not... It's a pretty straightforward class in many ways, but it's also a class that there are a lot of different things to keep track of, especially if you're trying to play at a higher level. If you're trying to play at a higher level, I definitely don't recommend using a gnome sequencer macro, because this is never going to perform as well as it would if you were handling all this separately. But what this is going to do is it's going to consolidate your rotation. It's going to make things more relaxed and easier for you if you can handle modifiers. If you don't like modifiers, again, simply remove the top block entirely, remove this filler block, and just handle all these abilities on separate buttons. I don't think that would be too bad for you to do. I actually think it's something I might even consider doing myself, because this is a little bit, like, I won't lie, this is probably the clunkiest thing about this macro, is trying to manage these, keeping track of the modifiers and things. But what I try to do is I try to make them this way and allow people to have this option, because it's very easy to simply get rid of this block here and not do that. So that's how it works. You have the options to adjust these as you see fit. But I hope this video was informative for you. I would love to hear what you think of this macro down in the comments below. And with all that being said, I will see you guys on the next one.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is Kephas. Until next time.